Nehemiah, one more time. These poor Jews, my goodness, these poor Jews. Look what's happening in Nehemiah chapter 10, verse 28. It says, "Now the rest of the people, the priests, the Levites, the gatekeepers, the singers, the temple servants," this is a large group of people, "and all those who had separated themselves from the peoples of the lands to the law of God." So this is a group of people that want to do right. They've come back into the land. They realize that they want to get back to the law, and they are going to make a promise. They're going to make 3 promises to God. We saw this as we ended last time. They are separating themselves from the people who live in the land, the Samaritans, the pagans that have moved into the land. They've separated themselves from them, and they are making a commitment to the law of God. It says their wives, their sons, and their daughters, all who had knowledge and understanding. And here's the commitment. They are joining with their kinsmen, their nobles, and are taking on themselves a curse. You don't have to do this. God never asked anybody to do this. But they were taking on themselves a curse and an oath to walk in God's law, which was given through Moses. We're talking about the 10 Commandments, all the 613 commandments, the Mosaic law. They are saying, let us be accursed if we don't follow the law. Which is crazy because no man can follow the law perfectly. Why in the world would you ever make a promise like this? Yet they did, which was given through Moses, God's servant, and to keep, this was the promise, to keep and to observe all the commandments of God our Lord, and His ordinances and His statutes. And so they focused on 3 particular parts of the law that they would do. This is what they said. Very next verse says this: we're going to obey all the laws of Moses, but especially we want the focus to be here because it had been a problem in Israel before. We will not give our daughters to the peoples of the land or take their daughters for our sons. We will not intermarry with non-Jews. We won't do it. In the very next verse, this is the next promise they make. "As for the peoples of the land," the Gentiles, "who bring wares or any grain on the Sabbath day to sell." Any of the merchants, any of the Gentile merchants who come in here that live in the land in the 100 years since we've been gone, 70 years, we're not going to engage with them in a business sense during the Sabbath day, the 6th day. We will not buy from them on the Sabbath or a holy day, and we will forego the crops the 70th year, and we will forgive debts that 70th year, the year of Jubilee. So, or the 7th year, and the exaction of every debt, the forgiving of the debts in the Sabbath years, and then certainly in the Jubilee year. That's what the promises they're making. Number 1, we won't intermarry. We will stay purely Jewish. Number 2, we will keep the Sabbath day. And then they made one more promise. Number 3, we also placed ourselves under obligation to contribute. Now we're talking about money here. Money, animals, the things that are necessary to take care of the temple and to take care of the priesthood. They make a promise to God. We also placed ourselves under obligation to contribute yearly 1/3 of a shekel for the service of the house of our God, for the showbread, for the continual grain offering, all these things that are needed in the Mosaic law, worship of Yahweh, for the continual burnt offering, the Sabbaths. Remember the burnt offering every single day at the tabernacle and at the tabernacle and at the temple after it. Every single day they were to take a lamb at dawn and kill it at daybreak, and in the evening they were to take a lamb at twilight and kill it. This is that continual burnt offering. They're saying they will continue offering the lambs. They'll continue supplying the lambs for the priests to do this. They'll supply for the Sabbaths, for the new moon, for the appointed times, for the holy things, for the sin offerings, to make atonement for Israel and all the work of the house of our God. They've made 3 promises. We won't intermarry. We will take care of the priests in the temple. And we will keep the Sabbath day. Those are the problems. Those are the promises that they make. And what we find out here in the book of Nehemiah in the last chapter is that in a very short amount of time, they went back. Let's just say they broke all three of those promises. Each of the specific promises that they called a curse on themselves for, we see in the book of Nehemiah, they broke all three of them. The reason, at least part of the reason in the hearts of these Jews that they broke these promises, you can find right here in Nehemiah chapter 13, verse 6. Nehemiah left. When they had a strong leader there, they were doing better. They were making these promises. They had this great ceremony where Nehemiah led, or the priests with Nehemiah went one way on the wall. Ezra and another group of priests with trumpets went another way on the wall. They went all the way around the city of Jerusalem. They met at the temple. They had these great offerings and music, and everything was joyous and rejoicing. This is under the time of Nehemiah. Nehemiah is leading all these things. And in Nehemiah chapter 13, verse 6, remember at the beginning of Nehemiah when Nehemiah was sad. Remember he comes up to King Artaxerxes, to whom he was the cupbearer, and the king asked him, "Why are you sad?" Nehemiah said, "Why shouldn't I be sad? The city of my forefathers, where my forefathers are buried. Remember, my father's tombs is in ruin. The walls, the gates are in disrepair." And the first thing Artaxerxes asked Nehemiah is, "How long will you be gone?" Because Artaxerxes is the king of the Persian Empire. So Nehemiah had to give him a date. Well, that means when the date comes, you've got to go back and present yourself in Susa, in Persia, to King Artaxerxes. And that's exactly what happens. We have a word of that in Nehemiah chapter 13, verse 6. 12 years have gone by, from 444 BC all the way to 432 BC, and Nehemiah has to leave and go back to Artaxerxes. It says in Nehemiah 13:6, "But during all this time I was not in Jerusalem. There was a period when I had to leave. For in the 32nd year of Artaxerxes, king of Babylon, I had gone to the king." In the 32nd year, he went back to Artaxerxes, who's the king of Babylon, the Persian Empire, after Babylon was defeated by the Medes and the Persians. And Nehemiah went back. And what's that old saying, when the cat's away, the mice will play. And that's exactly what you see in Israel over and over and over again. You see statements in the Bible like, Israel was obedient to the Lord their God all the days of Joshua. And then you go further in the book and it says things like, Israel was obedient to the Lord all the days of Josiah, all the days of Hezekiah. When you have these strong godly leaders pointing you to God, it's much easier to follow a godly leader. The godly leader leaves town for a while. When he comes back, he realizes very quickly that the oaths that he heard his countrymen make have all been broken. That Israel is back to their old tricks. He says, after some time, however, after going back to Susa, to the capital, after some time, however, I asked leave from the king and I came to Jerusalem. So before we get it, just quickly so you can see it, Israel's promises to Yahweh in the book of Nehemiah are these. Number one is that we will keep all the commandments of the law of Moses. But three specifically they lined out: no intermarriage with the pagans in the land. They would keep the Sabbath, number two. And number three, they would support the temple and its priests. We will contribute. And unfortunately, as I said very quickly, you see that things go wrong. Concerning intermarriage. In Nehemiah chapter 13, verse 23 to 24, this is what a returning Nehemiah, can you imagine what he expected to see? He would have expected to see exactly what he left. A rejoicing group of Jews, his countrymen, a rejoicing group of Jewish people following the laws of Moses, not intermarrying, contributing to the work in the temple, all of those things, keeping the Sabbath day. And what the poor man found, what the poor guy found was just the opposite. Must have been heart-wrenching to Nehemiah after all he had done for his people. Look what it says in 13 verse 23. In those days, after he had gone to Artaxerxes for a time, he asked leave, he came back. This is what we read. In the days when I returned. I'm taking these in the order that they made the promises. That's why the verse is, we're going to go to the end of 13 and then back up. Doesn't matter. I'm taking them in the order in which they promised them. The first thing they said is, we won't intermarry. Look what it says. In those days I saw that the Jews had married women. It must have broken his heart. It just must have crushed him. I saw that the Jews had married women from Ashdod, from Ammon and Moab. Do you remember at the beginning of this who the enemies were? Sanballat. There was another one that was from Ammon. There was a Moabite that came along. What Nehemiah is seeing is that the people that I stood up to so that we could secure God's city, Jerusalem, rebuild the walls and the gates of this city, the enemies that I stood up to are the very people that the people of Jerusalem were marrying. The sworn enemies of Yahweh that said, you cannot rebuild this city. That, if you go back to Nehemiah chapter 1, these are the ones represented. The Ashdod, the people from Ammon, the sons of Ammon and Moabites. I just can't imagine. As for their children. So you see, he was gone a little while. They'd long enough for them to have children. As for their children, look at what happened there. Half of them spoke the language of Ashdod. None of them was able to speak the language of Judah. They were speaking the language of his own people, the Ashdodites, the Ammonites, the Moabites. That's why hundreds of years later, when the Masoretes come along, you say, why was the language of Hebrew in danger of being lost? Why did the Masoretes find it so important to add vowels to the consonants so that this language would continue living? Well, you only have to go to the end of Nehemiah and see that the kids weren't speaking the language anymore. Why is that? Who teaches a kid a language? It's pretty much mama. Talks to them, sings to them, prays with them, plays with them. It's pretty much mom. Hear mom and dad speak, but mom has a tremendous role in teaching the children, organizing things for the children to do, keeping the keeping the child in obedience, disciplining the children. The kids hear from mom all day long while dad's out doing what dad has to do to put food on the table. So it's no surprise here that the language of Judah, the Hebrew language, is being lost. It's being lost, which is just unbelievable. It's just unbelievable. A couple verses later, this is what it says. Do we then hear about that you have committed all this great evil, acting unfaithfully against our God by marrying foreign women? Could this be true? What have you done? And look at the depths that this went to. Look at who is highlighted here. It says, even one of the sons of Jehoiada, the son of Elishevab, the high priest, even a family member of the high priest of Israel, was marrying a foreign woman, so I drove him away from me. And you think, well, that's really bad, but let's not forget Solomon in 1 Kings chapter 11 and all his foreign entourage of wives. But all that should be behind them. They've gone to Babylon for 70 years. They should have learned their lesson. They've taken God to his limit, and God has done exactly what he said he'd do in Deuteronomy 28, 29, 30. Leviticus chapter 26. He has kicked them out of the land and dispersed them to the nations. And here we have the return, and 100 or so years have gone by, and the high priest of Israel's family is intermarrying. So what does Nehemiah do, the great leader? Leave. Leave. I drove him away. I've told you before that the book of Malachi, turn to the book of Malachi with me. It's the last book before Matthew. Just get to Matthew. That's easy to find, and turn backwards to Malachi. Malachi is often called the last writings of the Bible. Last book of the Bible. Last book of the Old Testament, I should say. It looks like it is because of where it is, but I'm telling you, the events that Malachi writes about in the time period, exactly the same time period Nehemiah writes about. The last days of Nehemiah are the days in which Malachi wrote. I'm going to prove it to you. Look what it says in Malachi chapter 2, verse 10. What was the condition in the land? What is one of the things God has sent this prophet Malachi to tell Israel you are doing wrong? Look what it says. Do we not all have one Father? Has not one God created us? Why do we deal treacherously each against his brother so as to profane the covenant of our fathers? Judah has dealt treacherously, and an abomination has been committed in Israel and in Jerusalem, for Judah has profaned the sanctuary of the Lord which he loves, and has married the daughter of a foreign god. What's he talking about there? What's he speaking of? He's speaking of two things. You're not taking care of the temple, and you're marrying foreign women. That's exactly what they promised in Nehemiah. It's the same time period. That's what I'm trying to get you to understand. Same time period. Simple as that. Malachi wrote in the tail end of the historical events that happened in Nehemiah. The context, the content of their writings is identical. Only Nehemiah or Malachi is the one that got to push forward and say one day the herald will come, the one that Jesus called John the Baptist. The Sabbath. What about the Sabbath? Let's move to that. They promised in their second promise, we will keep the Sabbath day. We will obey the sabbatical year for the land. Remember, that's what got them kicked out the first. That's what made them leave the land for 70 years was their not keeping of the Sabbath, the sabbatical year for the land. So they were clear to add that into their specific promise. Look what it says in Nehemiah chapter 13, verse 15. Nehemiah 13, 15. What did they do as far as their promise to God? It wasn't a promise to Nehemiah. Who cares what Nehemiah thinks? This was the promise to their God, who had brought them back from Babylon, who had brought them back, who'd rebuilt their temple, who'd ushered in the priesthood, who brought Ezra back with all the utensils of the temple and the singers and all the rest. Look what it says in Nehemiah chapter 13 concerning the keeping of the Sabbath. In those days, which days? The days after he returned from Artaxerxes, after he was gone for a while. In those days I saw in Judah, some who were treading wine presses on the Sabbath. You could stop right there. It doesn't matter what you're doing, they're not keeping their promise to their God. You told me you would do all the law, specifically, I could watch and you would not intermarry and you would keep the Sabbath and you would produce or you would provide for my sanctuary. And here we are. A little bit of time has gone by. In those days I saw in Judah some who were treading wine presses on the Sabbath. What else were they doing? They were bringing in sacks of grain. They were trading with people. They were bringing in sacks of grain and loading them on donkeys, as well as wine, grapes, figs, all kinds of loads. They brought them into Jerusalem on the Sabbath day. Remember what they said? When somebody brings their wares or whatever, we're not going to trade with them on the Sabbath day. It's exactly what they're doing. It can't get any more direct. Exactly what they promised is exactly what they're doing. We keep going in the verse. It says, so I admonished them. Well, of course he did. He's not going to just sit back and let this happen. So the great leader Nehemiah admonished them on the day they sold food. Also men of Tyre were living there who imported fish. These are Gentiles from Tyre. They were living there. They imported fish and all kinds of merchandise. And they were selling them to the Jews, the sons of Judah, on the Sabbath, even in Jerusalem. And that's exactly what they said they would not do. As for the peoples of the land who bring wares or any grain, look what it says, bringing in sacks of grain. As for the people of the land who bring wares or any grain on the Sabbath day to sell, we will not buy from them on the Sabbath. And that's exactly what they're doing. We serve a merciful and long-suffering God, don't we? Nehemiah chapter 13, verse 17. It says, "Then I reprimanded the nobles of Judah, and I said to them, 'What is this evil thing you are doing by profaning the Sabbath day? Did not your fathers,'" now he brings up Jewish history, and he says this is exactly what got us into a mess years ago. He said, "Did not your fathers do the same? Profane the Sabbath day, not keep the Sabbath day, so that our God brought on us and on this city all this trouble? Don't you realize you're walking down the same road that God has kicked out to Babylon in the first place? How in the world are you doing this again? How is it? What is this evil thing you are doing? Yet you are adding to the wrath on Israel by profaning the Sabbath." How do you expect a holy and righteous God who has already disciplined our fathers for this, how do you expect Him to be different when you do the same thing? One more. The priests. He says that we will provide. We also placed ourselves under obligation to contribute yearly 1/3 of a shekel for the service of the house of our God. Nehemiah comes back expecting that to be done. He would have expected the temple to be in great repair, the sacrifices moving right along, the priests being taken care of. What does he find? Nehemiah chapter 13, verse 10. He says, "I also discovered," this poor man, "I also discovered that the portions of the Levites had not been given them." Exactly what they promised is exactly what they didn't do. "I also discovered that the portions of the Levites had not been given them, so that the Levites and the singers who performed the service had gone away, each to his own field." They couldn't eat in the temple. Nobody was providing for them in the temple. They had to go home and make a living for themselves. They were starving at the temple. It's just unbelievable, isn't it? Nehemiah chapter 13, verse 11, the very next verse. What does Nehemiah do? He reprimands them. He doesn't turn another cheek. He recognizes it's wrong. Obviously, he remembers the promises that they made. "So I reprimanded the officials, and I said, 'Why is the house of God forsaken? Why have you abandoned the taking care of the temple?' Then I gathered them together and I restored them to their posts." I'm sure some of them went kicking and screaming. All Judah then, when Nehemiah's back, things got straightened out, but not for long. All Judah then brought the tithe of the grain, the wine, and oil into the storehouses. Well, you bet they did, because Nehemiah was back. But if Nehemiah wasn't back, would this have changed? Or would they have continued forsaking the house of God? Of course they would have continued in that forsaking of the house of God. It was this godly leader, Nehemiah, that needed to lead. Well, Nehemiah says something here that's telling. I'm going to show you two verses. I said he says things like this several times in this book, but look at these two verses. The very next book. I tell you, Nehemiah must be exhausted by these people. The same way I can imagine Moses, after leading the Jews for 40 years, when God said, "Climb up Mount Nebo, you will not enter the promised land. You will not lead the Jews into the promised land." I can imagine at least a little bit of part of Moses saying, "Oh, thank you. Because this people has tried to stone me before. They complain about everything I do. I can't do anything right before these people. I can't lead them right. They tried to bring up another leader. They demand another leader." I'm sure that in Moses' heart there was a little bit of, "Great, I'll gladly climb up this hill." I said a little bit. He wanted to go into the promised land. But I'm sure there was a little bit of this. Nehemiah actually speaks things. We see the heart of this great leader of God. In Nehemiah chapter 13, 14, this is what he said: "Remember me for this, oh my God. Remember me for this. I've done everything I can. Before you, I've done everything I can do. And Nehemiah says, remember me for this, O my God, and do not blot out my loyal deeds which I have performed for the house of my God and its services. Please don't hold me accountable for the disaster that the temple is in, for the fact that the Levites have left to go to their own fields to try to make a crop that can feed them and their families. Please, Father, please don't hold that against me. I led the best way I knew how. I'm a godly leader of these men. I've done the best I can. Not claiming perfection, but asking God to remember him for the loyal deeds which he'd performed for the house of God and its service. If you turn back to Malachi, I just want to show you one more verse. Look in Malachi chapter 3. It will sound familiar. Look at Malachi chapter 3, verse 7 and 8. What's going on in the days of Malachi? The exact same things. It's the exact same days. This is how Malachi says it. From the days of your fathers you have turned aside from my statutes and have not kept them. The grace of God says, return to me and I'll return to you. Return to me and I'll return to you, says Yahweh of hosts. But you say, how shall we return? And look what it says in verse 8. Will a man rob God, steal from God? Yet you are robbing me. But you say, how have we robbed you? And God responds, in tithes and offerings. You're not bringing to the temple what the Mosaic law demands of you. You're not supporting the temple. You're not providing for the temple. We placed ourselves under obligation to contribute yearly 1/3 of a shekel for the service of the house of God, for the showbread, for the continual grain offering, for the continual burnt offering. You're not doing it. Exact same time period. You're not doing it. Malachi 3:7. One more verse, short night. Look what it says in Nehemiah chapter 5, verse 19. He says it again. Or he said it for the first time. Nehemiah chapter 5, verse 19. I tell you, there are 2 or 3 or 4 times when Nehemiah will implore God to honor him for what he's done. Reward me based on my good, loyal deeds. In Nehemiah chapter 5, verse 19, Nehemiah says, remember me, O my God. Same phrase he used in chapter 13. Remember me, O my God, for good. I'm doing everything you asked me to do. The fact that my countrymen are allowing this thing to go to pot, please don't hold me accountable for that. Couldn't we say the same thing today? The fact that my countrymen are allowing what's happening to happen in our country, please, Father, remember me for good according to all that I have done for this people. It's exactly what Nehemiah says to God. According to all that I have done for this people. The poor man must have been absolutely heartbroken when he walked back into Jerusalem and saw exactly what they'd promised they wouldn't do when he saw them doing it. Remember, that was what led this whole thing in the first place. Nehemiah was very sad when his brother came, Hanani, and told him that Jerusalem was in disrepair. That's exactly what started this whole story. The king saying, why are you sad? Nehemiah is bold enough to go to King Artaxerxes, who had said 2 years earlier, stop rebuilding this evil and wicked city. Nehemiah goes to the king in courage, knowing that God has sent him to the king. He goes to Jerusalem, 9-month trip, or maybe a 4-month trip, 900 miles. He goes out at night. Remember this wonderful, valiant story. He's there for 3 days. He finds men he can trust. He leads them around the city. He sees and develops a scope of the work. He brings these families together. He stands against the enemies of God, the Moabites, the Ammonites, all these people, Sanballat and Tobiah and all these people that come against him. Over and over, he's taken it on the chin for God's people. Restores the city of God in 52 days. And what does he get for all his trouble? He leaves to go back to the king for a while. He comes back, and it's right back to where we were 150 years ago. It's like you folks just don't learn. And we see after the book of Nehemiah closes and after the book of Malachi closes, a 400-year silence from God that Obadiah prophesied. Obadiah in chapter 8, you wonder, why in the world would God do this? Why would God prophesy that one day there would be a famine, not for food and not for water, but for the word of God? Well, it's clear Israel didn't want it. Israel didn't want it. They had it. It was read to them by Ezra. They were reintroduced to it in a wonderful and perfect way. And instead of doing what they promised to do, they chose themselves not to do it and proved themselves to be just who they were before. And so in Amos chapter 8, verse 11, you hear God say, "Behold, days are coming." And these days are after the days of Nehemiah. "Behold, days are coming, declares Yahweh, when I will send a famine on the land, not a famine for bread or a thirst for water, but rather for hearing the words of the Lord." I'll go silent. No more prophets. No more prophets until John the Baptist stands up and says, "Behold, the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world." 400 years go by, and Almighty God is silent with Israel. Of course, they have the scrolls. They can continue learning. They can choose to worship God. But what are we seeing? At the end of this period of Israel's history, before Jesus would come 400 years later, they have chosen to make a promise and not keep it. What do we see in God? The opposite. God made a promise to Israel, and He will keep it. So even though we have Israel here reeling under their own bad decisions, what we see in the book of Jeremiah and a lot of other places, and I'll take you to these soon, probably next time we meet, what we see in the book of Jeremiah is this wonderfully loving, gracious, long-suffering, patient God who says things like this to these people. "Even though you have yet again rejected me." This is what He says. "Behold, days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant." What a God. "When I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah." What a God. "Not like the covenant which I made with their fathers in the day I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt, my covenant which they broke." Again and again and again in the book of Nehemiah. "Even though," he says, "I was a husband to them. But this is the covenant which I will make with the house of Israel after those days, declares the Lord. I will put my law within them, even if they don't want it." What a God. "I'll put my law within them, and on their heart I will write it. And I will be their God, and they shall be my people. They will not teach again, each man his neighbor and each man his brother, saying, 'Know Yahweh,' for they will all know me, from the least of them to the greatest of them, declares the Lord. For I will forgive their iniquities, and their sin I will remember no more." Who is this God we serve? Unending grace. Let's close in prayer.